Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's launch of the Oxford Principles for Responsible Engagement with Article 6. It's my delight today to share the agenda ahead of us and to again welcome you to explore this very important topic that's occurring at a very timely time ahead of Bonn and in light of the overall operationalization of Article 6. So we'll kick things off today with some opening remarks from Professor Mette Morsing, who's Director of the Smith School for Sustainability and Enterprise here at the University of Oxford, who will speak to us about the importance of the Article 6 principles for responsible engagement in a changing world. I will then introduce a little bit more about the process of the principles and introduce you to the wonderful co-author team, and we'll then move to unpack each of the principles in turn before leaving some time for Q&A. Here is our esteemed panel. As I said, we'll be kicking off with Professor Mette Morsing, who is the director of the Smith School and fellow at St. Edmund Hall. Professor Morsing's area of research expertise relates to organizational theory and good governance, and she was previously head of the Principles for Responsible Management Education over at the UN Global Compact, and so is well versed to speak to us today about the importance of principles. I'll then pass over to fellow co-authors, Dr. Axel McElwer, who's head of international climate policy at the University of Zurich and Center for Comparative and International Studies. He's also senior founding partner at the consultancy Perspectives Climate Group, and for over 2 decades has been working on climate policy issues, authoring a wide range of outputs in this space, and very much working to help operationalize both the Paris Agreement and Kyoto Protocol's carbon trading mechanisms. And last but by no means least, we have Dr. Lambert Schneider, who is the research coordinator for international climate policy at the OICO Institute over in Berlin. He's also worked for several decades in carbon markets and in the international climate negotiations. He was a member of the Clean Development Mechanism Executive Board and continues to lead the research team over at the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative. So an excellent team today to be presenting and exploring these principles with you. And without further ado, I'll now pass over to Professor Morsing, who will give some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much for having me here today, and good morning, colleagues from around the world. A warm welcome to today's launch of the Oxford Principles for Responsible Engagement with Article 6. And thank you to the Blavatsky School of Government here at Oxford for hosting this webinar. My name is Professor Mette Morsing, and I'm Professor of Business Sustainability, as I've already been introduced, here at Oxford, and I'm also the Director of the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. And I'm delighted to be here to warmly welcome you to the launch of the Oxford Principles for Responsible Engagement with Article 6. This is a set of science-based, integrity-driven criteria to help ensure that the next generation of international carbon markets enables us to scale climate litigation and resilience. The principles represent the culmination of months of work and collaboration between 15 co-authors representing 7 different institutions, drawing on several decades of international carbon market expertise. As many of you will be aware, Article 6 has emerged as one of the most technically complex and politically consequential aspects of international climate cooperation under the Paris Agreement. And within this context, these principles are a timely contribution as carbon trading under the Paris Agreement reaches a critical juncture where it could either help or harm efforts to stay well below 2 degrees. The current international rules established under Article 6.2 and 6.4 create a floor rather than a ceiling of integrity, leaving considerable discretion to the user as to how to act responsibly. And the goal of the Oxford Principles for Article 6 is to provide essential guidance and guardrails to governments, corporates, and other actors to enable this international framework to be used in a responsible manner. We hope it helps foster international carbon markets that drive genuine climate action and provide incentives to enhance ambition as opposed to serving as a smokescreen for inaction. From the standpoint of the Smith School for Enterprise and the Environment here at the University of Oxford, we are proud to offer the principles as another example of our role bridging science and academia and true real-world impact. The Smith School exists to help transform economies and systems of governance for a future in which both people and nature can thrive. And we enable this transition through non-partisan, evidence-based research, rigorous teaching, and pragmatic systems-focused approaches. Our work tackles the global challenges of net zero, sustainable development, and climate resilience. And we are also pushing into new frontiers, including how climate intersects with health, trade, security, and inclusive economic growth. Our reputation for academic integrity and independence allows us to be a trusted partner to decision makers in policy, finance, and business and alike. You may be familiar with another related one of our flagship outputs, the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting, which have seen uptake from actors ranging from the White House to Netflix, extending to asset managers managing over 13 trillion British pounds in assets. And this illustrates the real-world impact that can be had from translating the sciences of net zero into practical realities. And we are serious about turning academic theory into practice, which today is indeed an evidence of. And we're very proud that our outputs provide a robust and evidence-led platform for different actors to be able to engage in these critical areas for the net zero transition. Impartial and independent guidance can go a long way to help building trust and credibility, and now more than ever, such guidance is needed, especially in areas where trust has broken down, such as the international carbon market. Looking back to the first generation of carbon trading mechanisms reveals how far we've come, but also the challenges and the changes we still need to see in the second generation of markets under the Paris Agreement. And the Kyoto Protocol marked a watershed moment for carbon markets, driving the first wave of carbon trading. But allegations of trading hot air under the Kyoto Protocol's mechanisms abounded, and leading, as we know, to questions as to the environmental integrity of the units and the level of trust that actors could have in the system. And still today, recent analysis will show us that for the initial batch of carbon credits set to be released under Article 6.4 of the agreement, only one in every 26 is likely to represent real emission reductions. At the same time, we know the world is only becoming more international, and the Paris Agreement, close to uniting all countries in the world behind a mitigation target, is a testament to that. Carbon pricing is also increasingly on the rise. In 2005, just 8 schemes were in place. As of 2024, 75 schemes are in place, with a further 45 under development as we speak. Article 6 offers a pathway to further connect these developments. And as these schemes develop, attention needs to be paid to how they contribute to a net zero aligned future, including via the mechanisms provided by Article 6. Article 6 is the backbone of international carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. If implemented well, it has the potential to unlock finance, catalyze ambition, and direct climate mitigation to where it's most needed. But if misused, it could become a loophole, allowing countries or corporates to claim climate progress on paper while avoiding genuine decarbonization. And this is why integrity, transparency, and ambition must be hardwired into how we engage with Article 6. The Oxford Principles for Responsible Engagement with Article 6 are complementary to, but go beyond the minimum standards currently enshrined in the Paris Agreement rulebook. And in this way, represent a call to action for countries, corporates, intermediaries, and project developers to engage with carbon markets in a way that strengthens, rather than undermines, the goals of the Paris Agreement. Indeed, over 30 countries have already aligned with a vision of high integrity carbon markets via the San Jose Principles in 2019. The 2025 Oxford Principles for Article 6 now extend and update that ambition and ground it in the latest science and policy insights. And as such, I would encourage researchers, practitioners, and policymakers here joining us today at the launch to engage with these principles, not just as a framework, but as an invitation to interrogate, apply, and iterate on what responsible climate cooperation in the era of the Paris Agreement should look like. The Smith School remains committed to generating rigorous policy-relevant scholarship, and we believe international carbon trading is one of the most pressing areas where that scholarship now must be applied. So, with a huge congratulations for a big work that is being launched today, I will now hand back to you, Dr. Ingi Johnstone, and you will introduce the next agenda here for today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Mossing, for joining us here today and for those reflections. I'll now shift to introduce our wonderful co-authoring team, and would really like to take this time to extend a very generous thanks to all involved in this project for their care, expertise, and dedication over these past months. You've already had a little bit of a flavor for the depth of expertise involved in terms of the authoring team behind the principles, which does exceed well over a century's worth of experience in this sphere, and contributes perspectives from a variety of dimensions, whether it's legal, economic, technical, and we really do hope we've put together some principles that will be utilized by actors out in the real world. And so, as Meta said, this process involved 15 co-authors from Oxford and beyond to come together to develop, debate, and define what responsible engagement looks like across geographies, economic realities, and different net zero transition pathways. And as always, this journey has been just as worthwhile as the end destination, with the diversity of thought amongst the co-authors, as well as the inputs from reviewers of the principles at various stages. And we really hope through the principles to illustrate what a key piece of international infrastructure Article 6 is, and that it's really well worth thinking about how to utilize it in the most responsible manner. I'll now turn to provide a little bit of an overview of who the principles apply to and how they should be applied. So as you can see here, the principles and designing them, we were really conscious of the entire ecosystem that is involved in applying them, recognizing that responsible use does depend on everyone within their respective roles, as well as collectively working together to ensure end-to-end integrity. Now, it's worth also stressing from the outset that each of these principles that we'll be unpacking today needs to be interpreted in lockstep with one another in order to deliver that responsible use. And so while there are 3 high-level principles that interlock, there are also undergirding criteria, which we'll walk through today. And all of these are designed to be applied in tandem with the existing guidance set forth under the Paris Agreement, including the Article 6 rules to date. So that's a really important piece there. Excellent. We'll now turn to unpack Principle 1, which is ensuring the use of mitigation outcomes is aligned with the Paris Agreement. So one of the key questions here in terms of the chicken and egg scenario that could emerge in the carbon market is that it actually does start with demand, because without which there isn't supply. And so that's why we opted to take a rather different route in the principles and actually begin by considering what a responsible demand side looks like first. And here we have 2 sub-principles. So first, ensuring that engagement with Article 6 raises climate ambition in line with the Paris Agreement. And this is essential because Article 6 is one of many levers that exist to realize the Paris Agreement's 3 long-term goals and needs to be embedded in a manner that does not undermine it. And secondly, developing and implementing Article 6 engagement strategies and governance arrangements, which is also key to really engage with Article 6 in an intentional manner and in a manner that utilizes it with care. So turning to some of the criteria, the first one is enhancing ambition and avoiding mitigation deterrence. Indeed, housed within Article 6.1 of the Paris Agreement is the fact that Article 6 is a voluntary framework designed to accelerate ambition rather than undermine it. And this means all users of the principles need to ensure that they are on a science-aligned decarbonisation trajectory and only use Article 6 to accelerate their ambition beyond this. Specifically, this means that parties under the Paris Agreement should use Article 6 to close the ambition gap rather than the implementation gap in nationally determined contributions and long-term low emissions development strategies. Equally, for entities, whether this is a corporate engaging in Article 6, we also need to see that same level of a focus on deeply reducing emissions and following best practice offsetting guidance in this regard. And thirdly, it's necessary, given the high stakes involved, for all parties to conduct additional due diligence to ensure against mitigation deterrence. Again, this is key because Article 6 remains an optional mechanism that you should use with care. At the same time, we know that it's important from the first generation of carbon market activities to ensure that the communities where these activities are taking place have and receive ongoing sustainable development benefits. And so this is why it's really important that we also consider this from the demand side. Thirdly, it's also crucial that given that Article 6 houses all manner of different cooperative approaches, and unlike the carbon market of the past, we need to actually ensure that the mitigation outcomes are shared fairly between the host country and buyers. This is important both to ensure equity, but to also ensure that the foot is always on the gas of ambition and acceleration rather than undermining it. And then fourthly, and as will be familiar to those already deeply engaged in Article 6, we actually need to make sure that it creates an ongoing contribution to global mitigation and adaptation efforts. Indeed, under Article 6, we had the very first recognition that offsetting isn't a zero-sum game, and we really want to stress, in line with the role that it could play in this regard, to all three different long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, including aligning these financial flows. And this is really critical that we think about it not only in terms of 6.4, where of course it's mandatory, but equally under 6.2. So that's principles 1.A. In terms of principle 1.B, it's quite interesting because now it has been close to 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed. And so in some respects, we've seen Article 6 coming for a long time. But until quite recently, the very specifics of what engagement could look like has been very unclear, and including to what extent the mechanism will actually be utilized. But now we have the rule book and we have the framework to engage. It is incredibly important that organizations develop an engagement strategy. And so while we've had flavors, of course, for what strategies for how host countries and buyer countries have been engaging to date, we've not yet seen a level of uptake of a holistic approach that clearly does articulate coherent and transparent planning of a strategy that outlines, publicly discloses, and ensures that it is up to date with the latest science, but equally as progress under the mechanism unfolds and lessons of implementation are learnt. Secondly, it is incredibly important to go beyond unconditional climate mitigation. So again, this comes back to ensuring that any kind of responsible engagement strategy requires engaging in Article 6 in a way that does not undermine the other parts of the Paris Agreement, especially Article 9, which delivers climate finance. And this is why we elaborate some criteria in relation to not counting internationally traded mitigation outcomes towards climate finance targets under the Paris Agreement, and equally not using what's termed mitigation contribution units for unconditional nationally determined contributions. This is essential because we need Article 6 to unlock new capital, to scale ambition, and in a way that does not ensure that its key financing is actually used to already finance activities that were going to occur anyway. And next, on top of this, it's really important that we design clear governance arrangements. So both host nations as well as buyer nations should very clearly outline their arrangements for transacting in Article 6. So it's very clear the lines of cooperation and responsibilities within that space too. And this is essential because the Paris Agreement has long-term goals for a reason. It is a long-term agreement, and it's essential that robust governance arrangements do stand the test of time, especially for key processes involving authorization, issuances, and transactions of ITMOs. And last but by no means leastly, for carbon trading to function as economically efficiently as possible, we need it to start resembling a true market, which means having more readily disclosed information on what informs price formation, as well as the cost of the project in relation to the kind of margins applied along the way, again, to ensure that it remains an efficient financing mechanism for a given type of project. With that, I'll now conclude on Principle 1 and pass over to Dr. Axel Makawa, who will unpack Principle 2. Thank you very much.
So I hope I'll be able to share my screen. Actually, I had to send a request and yeah, perfect. Thank you. Good. Principle 2 relates to integrity of mitigation and, of course, integrity with regard to social and environmental impacts of the activities that are done under Article 6. So with regard to the mitigation integrity, of course, the key criterion is additionality. We've seen that additionality, or the lack of it, has led to the downfall of the CDM. You are seeing the debate in the European Union with regard to the use of ITMOs, and there is always reference to the CDM failing, largely on the account of lack of additionality. And of course, we've also seen the downfall of the voluntary carbon market, mostly on this issue. So we've now the third chance to get it right after failing twice. And therefore, we need to ensure that it is clear that business as usual activities are not entering Article 6. And that's, of course, critical for 6.2. Under 6.4, we now have beautiful additionality standard and specific rules. But under Article 6.2, we have been seeing stuff that reminds us of the past days of the CDM. Then, of course, we have the new criterion, avoiding lock-in, that we should not generate incentives to continue use of fossil fuels. We need to ensure that we have a robust quantification of mitigation outcomes that relates both to baseline setting and to the overall monitoring, reporting, and verification. What we now need in the context of the Paris Agreement is the downward adjustment of baselines over time. Fortunately, again, Article 6.4 has developed a set of rules that is progressive and stringent, but we don't know whether this actually will be taken up under Article 6.2. And if we look at some of the early 6.2 activities, I don't really see the downward adjustment of baselines there. So this is absolutely critical, and it needs to increase over time. The guidance that we've seen under the baseline standard of Article 6.4 is good. Of course, it could still be increased, but we have the right approach, and we need to ensure that this is undertaken across all Article 6 approaches. Then, of course, the taking into account all sources of uncertainty, both in the baseline and in the activity emissions assessment. And I think that the market has not yet realized what it actually means. That if we have a lack of clarity, we need to discount significantly, and that will, of course, reduce the generation of credits. And there, all of us need to learn, and I hope that this learning will not lead to scandals, but that will lead to an approach where everyone has a clear understanding. If the data are not good, then there will be a significant discounting of the credits. The next aspect relates mostly to carbon stores that are generated by removals activities, but that of course could also relate to emission reductions, especially in the forestry space. We know that in the context of the reversals, there is a lot of regulatory work going on under Article 6.4. It is pointing into the right direction. We don't know yet what will be the outcome, but I hope that as we've seen for additionality and baseline setting, that the 6.4 rules will provide a good benchmark for addressing reversals in other contexts. I just wanted to note that we have, of course, various processes on removals and reversals, for example, inside the European Union, and that there are clear statements from reputed think tanks that the methodological approaches currently discussed in the EU are not actually in line with what should be achieved. A very important criterion is avoiding of double counting. That, of course, under Article 6 would be done through corresponding adjustments. But of course, we know that under Article 6.4, we have the mitigation contribution units that don't need the corresponding adjustment. And we also know that we have a lot of authorizations where it's not really clear how the corresponding adjustments will actually be done under Article 6.2. And if I look at some stuff that is out there, unilateral authorizations that are not transparent, I hope that we'll see actually the governments that have issued these unilateral authorizations reconsider it also on the context of the Baku decisions, because I would otherwise fear that we'll actually get into some double counting, double claiming, double issuance problems. Then, and Ingi has already mentioned it, we need to ensure that we don't have a diversion of international public climate finance for the acquisition of ITMOs. We had this already under the CDM, that the OECD was quite clear that ODA could not be used for the acquisition of certified emission reductions. So we think, of course, that this needs to be continued now in the context of Article 6 as well. And then, of course, we need rigorous governance of the crediting programs. We know that many crediting programs that have so far focused on the voluntary market want to get into Article 6. We also know that they are lobbying governments to become one-stop shop service providers, especially for poor countries that do not have the resources. And of course, this is highly risky. And we need to ensure that the governance of these programs actually is sufficiently robust to prevent conflicts of interests. And I just want to note one specific element that we've put into our principles, that there need to be sanctions against underperforming auditors. I just want to note, for example, in the voluntary carbon market under Vera stated that there are severe problems with rice field methane reductions in China, but there was no sanction, neither against the auditors nor against the buyers of the credits, and that needs to be there. then, of course, the environmental and social safeguards are important. We know under CDM there was a lot of criticism that the project would actually not contribute to sustainable development. So a critical precondition for ensuring positive contributions are appropriate consultations with stakeholders. Under the CDM, for example, there was a lot of pro forma consultations. Project developers sent some letters to some friends and claimed that this was a proper consultation, which of course it was not. And that eroded a lot of trust. So now under our principles and criteria, local and global consultations are needed. And I think, for example, what the gold standard has been doing in the past is best practice. Then, of course, we need an identification of negative environmental and social impacts that could be generated by the activities. We also need safeguards, and here there is a list of what these safeguards should address. Definitely we have only limited experience to really have credible safeguards. So we all need to learn a lot in that context. And of course, we need to ensure that the activity design and implementation is done in a way that it generates co-benefits. It ensures that local communities have access to these co-benefits, and also that there is access to appropriate and effective grievance mechanisms. The CDM was never able to set up a grievance mechanism. Now, fortunately, under Article 6.4, we have a grievance mechanism. Actually, Perspectives did a study of grievance mechanisms that have been applied under various also voluntary carbon market programs. So we think that the 6.4 grievance mechanism holds promise. So again, of course, for any 6.2 developer, such grievance mechanisms should be absolutely looked at. I just want to note that, for example, we see a lot of work now in the context of REDD+ credits under the R3s program, and R3s had a grievance process in Guyana, which in our view actually doesn't fulfill what we have in our principles. And of course, R3s, these are now the most sought after credits in the context of CORSIA with corresponding adjustments. So they would run under Article 6.2. So I think this is really imperative to work there quickly and in a comprehensive manner. So with that, I would like to stop sharing and pass on to Lambert.
Thank you, Axel. I will try to share, and if that does not work, then we'll ask someone else. Does that work? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I turn to Principle 3, which is ensuring robust accounting and transparent engagement with Article 6. And that has two sub-principles, one relating to robust accounting and one relating to transparency on the use and generation of mitigation outcomes. So of course, robust accounting is really key, and many accounting rules have been agreed on that under Article 6.2. But in our perspectives, there are some gaps and some areas that need further clarity to really ensure that double accounting is avoided and that emissions do not increase as a result of the accounting rules. So the first principle relates to national inventories. There is a requirement under the Paris Agreement from Glasgow that countries should have inventory, but it doesn't set any qualifications. And so in these principles, we set minimum requirements regarding the coverage, the gases, the IPCC tiers, with a view to ensuring what is often referred to inventory visibility, so that the actions from Article 6 are actually visible in inventories. Then what's also important and also recognized under the decisions from Glasgow is a strong NDC foundation. So countries should have submitted an NDC. We think it's also important that they have a long-term low emission development strategy, and that ultimately the emissions level is clearly quantified in an absolute emissions level. That can also be done ex post in some instances, but then it needs to be absolutely clear how the quantification works. There are some more criteria on strong NDC foundation. This presentation is only an extraction of our criteria, but one I would like to point to is the use of multi-year accounting approaches. This is a quite detailed topic, but under the Paris Agreement, there are different ways of how to account for the transfers of ITMOs. And there are some approaches which are multi-year accounting approaches, like multi-year targets, multi-year trajectories, and there's also averaging. And there are studies we have been looking into detailed into averaging, and it actually can lead to higher global emissions in certain circumstances, and in a way lead to double counting. So we would strongly encourage countries to use multi-year accounting approaches rather than averaging. Unfortunately, what we see is that in the initial reports, a number of countries have already, most countries, I would say, have proposed averaging. And in particular, if the use of ITMOs increases over time and the buyer countries are using multi-year accounting, this will lead globally to higher emissions, even if all the mitigation outcomes have integrity. NDC coverage is also important. We recommend that buyer countries have economy-wide NDCs, and that for host countries, at least all sectors, all categories, all gases and pools that are materially affected by Article 6 activities are covered. And this is partially in a way to protect the host countries, because they need to apply corresponding adjustments regardless of whether the emissions are covered, regardless of whether they are visible in inventories. And so ensuring that these emissions are covered makes sure that the country doesn't need to apply a corresponding adjustment, but cannot count the emission reduction towards its own NDC, and basically would create a deficit for the country. Then what's important is host country authorizations. Their detailed decisions have been taken in Baku at the most recent COP. And we think it's important that the template that was agreed there, which is voluntary, that is used, because as Axel mentioned, what we see is in some of the Article 6 corporations that not all the information is included in authorizations to later follow up on the ITMO flows and to avoid double counting and to have clarity how corresponding adjustments are applied. And if that information is lacking, then again, this could lead to double counting. We also identified gaps in the accounting cycle for LDCs and SIDs. LDCs and SIDs have a lot of flexibility under the Paris Agreement, and this is good and this is important. And one of these flexibilities is that the biannual transparency reports can be submitted at their discretion, meaning whenever they want to. But in the context of Article 6, that's not a good solution, because where corresponding adjustments are applied, that is in these BTR reports. And so if these reports are never being submitted, then authorizations may have happened, but the corresponding adjustments are never applied later on. And so also here, to close the accounting cycle and ensure that double counting is avoided, we have set up some requirements for LDCs and SIDs, which are looser than for other countries, but to make sure that they submit their reports at sufficient times to ensure that the accounting balances are closed before that the reports are submitted before the accounting balances are being closed. On transparency and the use and generation of mitigation outcomes, we have two criteria, one on the use of mitigation outcome and one on the generation of mitigation outcome. We think it's important to provide really detailed information on credit use, and that holds both for countries and for companies. Very often, if you look into ESG and other reporting of companies, for example, you find information of what kind of type of mitigation activities they were using to buy carbon credits. but you never find really the detailed information. What are the exact mitigation activities? And in our view, that should even go down to the serial numbers of the carbon credits that have been used. And that is also in a way important to avoid double counting, to avoid that a single carbon credit is claimed by two different companies, to have that transparency. And some registries, like the gold standard, they already provide a lot of transparency on cancellations, but we think that companies should provide the same level of transparency. That also expands to the use of claims, like to communicate clearly what claims the company is making and making these claims in a very transparent manner in relation to carbon credits. Similar provisions hold for the generation of mitigation outcomes. We also think that countries should provide public information on authorizations, on ITMO transfers, etc. A lot of that information will at some stage be uploaded to the CARB, to a database managed by the UNFCCC. But we think it would be good practice that countries also provide that information on their relevant websites. So this concludes our run through the principles, and I head over to Inji.
Great, thank you so much, Lambert. And so now you'll see the QR code, which will take you to the webpage where you can download the principles and read them, including the criteria in detail. And if you could please go, actually, we'll leave this slide up for a while, but we do have time now for some Q&A. We've seen some questions coming through in the chat. Please submit them, and we will, switch over to that portion now. And so, kicking us off with the first question, we have one from Lasse Leipola from Finwatch, which is a question regarding criteria 1.82, which is pursuing mitigation activities with significant sustainable developments. And the question relates to how does this relate to high quality CDR activities, including direct air capture? Should these be excluded from the portfolio if they do not have this significant sustainable development benefits, including adaptation, biodiversity, potential to avert loss and damage? So I'll hand over to Axel first to provide an answer, and then we'll see how the other panelists think. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, we've had exactly these discussions in the context of the CDM. Should, for example, industrial gas plants be acceptable or not? And there was a lot of debate in those days. So direct air capture, of course, given that it is unlikely to have direct sustainable development co-benefits, of course, needs to be, for example, ensure that the electricity that it uses doesn't reduce electricity access for the local population. I'm just giving example. In Kenya, there is a lot of discussion, and startups are promoting direct air capture. Now we know that, of course, Kenya has a high availability of geothermal energy, but we also know that it doesn't have 100% electrification. So the direct air capture projects in Kenya, in my view, would have to ensure that they contribute to a penetration of electricity access before they get going. Similarly, of course, when it comes to job creation, these projects will need maintenance. So if such a project specifically does local, it creates local jobs, then of course it would definitely contribute to sustainable development. But yeah, it should not just be a kind of alien in its environment. Thank you.
Oh, Lambert, would you like to come in on this as well?
No, I think that's
okay, wonderful. Well, yeah, and I'd just like to, again, building off Axel's point, sustainable development relates to social, economic, and environmental. And of course, we've got to be practical that we're speaking to a number of different mitigation pathways, and any kind of criteria have to be considered in light of that. And that's also why, we're not creating a standard here. It does need to then be applied to the specific context. Excellent. We have another question here related to how the principles complement other principles and guidelines relating to Article 6, including those issued by the Secretariat, CORSIA, ICBCM, and the like. So I wondered, Lambert, if you'd like to come in on this point to answer Brian's question.
Yes. Yeah, I think what's important is that in our view, these principles should apply in conjunction with relevant decisions that have been taken under Article 6. We note, and I think Axel referred to that, that under Article 6.4, much more comprehensive decisions have been taken than under Article 6.2. So some of our principles, and we make that transparent in the document, kind of overlap a little bit with the decisions that have been taken under Article 6.4. And we think it's important that the same principles are being applied under Article 6.2. I think COSIA really doesn't embrace these principles. COSIA has some principles for the quality of mitigation outcomes, but it doesn't have any principles that relate in specifically with the provisions for Article 6 other than the avoiding of double counting. So it doesn't have any provisions for making sure that mitigation outcomes are shared, that ambition is being raised. All these matters are not addressed. It allows averaging as a use of an accounting approach, etc. So, to my knowledge, there are other guidance and documents. For example, there's very useful guidance on the use of mitigation outcomes. Various initiatives. There are various initiatives out there addressing the quality of mitigation outcomes, like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, and others. They're the rating agencies. But to my knowledge, there's no set of criteria that really looks into the specificities and the dynamics of Article 6, like the key principles of Article 6, and introduces them in a comprehensive manner. And I think these principles really fill this gap.
Thank you, Lambert. And building off of that, it's important to kind of acknowledge that while there isn't numerous standards to kind of operationalize Article 6, what we do here is introduce perhaps a normative element illustrating that it is a voluntary framework, and that because of that, it's really important to emphasize responsible use of that. We'll turn now to a question related to Principle 1B2, which describes the need for financial flows to not be counted towards the climate finance goals of the Paris Agreement. And so I'd just like to come back to this point, and we illustrate it specifically in relation to Article 9 in the principles document, because it's really important that, again, we look at the whole Paris package and ensure that use of Article 6 does not undermine separate and rather unconditional flows of climate finance that have been promised under that provision. And so, ITMOs do come at a cost, and they come at a cost of a corresponding adjustment and other kind of administrative burdens and whatnot. And so we really seek to ensure, as part of this principle, that we're not seeing it be used as a primary channel for climate finance, or as a channel for climate finance. And that distinguishes it from perhaps the MCU, which of course, have a function as a contribution unit. And so we are aware that some countries are looking to use that as a higher standard of providing climate finance, but ITMOs are conditional, and so do not and should not contribute to the kind of unconditional climate finance objectives of the Paris Agreement. Does anyone else want to come in on this question? Otherwise we can, no, excellent. Okay, brilliant. We have a question from Felix Schmidt, which is, can you provide some more details on the downward adjustment to ensure robust quantification? Would it be a default adjustment factor, project specific? Do you have any best practice recommendations? So I'll pass this over to Axel. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I've done a lot of work on downward adjustment, actually published a piece in Climate Policy, how I would see the ideal form of downward adjustment, that it should be a linear path towards the net zero target of the host country. We, of course, know that in reality, then in the negotiations and discussions of bodies like the supervisory body, things get a bit more messy. But what we now have in the baseline standard is that there needs to be a minimum annual downward adjustment of 1%. So that is the floor. Of course, I would say it's not sufficient. It should be more. If we would now take our aim of the Paris Agreement seriously to achieve net zero in the second half of the century, it means that the downward adjustment lead to a zero level of the baseline for emission reductions between 2050 and 2100. I would say, yes, a country level differentiation makes sense. I think project level differentiation does not make sense, and I find it unfortunate that the supervisory body was unable to agree on a country level differentiation for obvious reasons, and now has somehow thrown the ball to the DNAs and methodology developers to apply sector-specific approaches, and of course then mixing it up with the economic attractiveness of the project. So I think we have some elephants, or at least elephant calves, in the room there, and need to address this properly. But my preferred approach would be now a 2% downward adjustment annually for most countries, maybe a bit more lenient for the least developed countries. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Axel. We have an interesting question here from Suchi, and wanting to pass it over to you, Lambert, which is there a buyer beware tag associated with unilateral authorization?
No, we haven't included that in our recommendation. I mean, in my view, you should have beware tag for any authorization, right? So I think it doesn't really matter whether it's unilateral or bilateral. The Article 6 requirements for authorization are the same. And it's really important that host countries provide all that information in the authorization, regardless of whether it's a unilateral or a bilateral approach.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We have a question related to implementation under the Paris Agreement and how it's designed to help stakeholders close their ambition gap. And this question here from Bright says, have we considered the risk that the implementation of Article 6 could be substituted for almost all global mitigation efforts if care is not taken? And this is a really important point, and this is why we can put it in principle 1, that it is essential that we don't see Article 6 as just a direct implementation financing substitute. Again, we have other levers of the Paris Agreement, and it's important that it is utilized in a comprehensive manner. And so, that's why we encourage use of all levers. And again, care paid to the specific type of lever and what specific type of use it relates to. So thank you for the question. We also have a question here about when the principles recommend against using international climate finance for ITMOs, would this include ITMOs that are not used towards by a country's NDCs, i.e. that are used to raise global ambition? That's there from Kenneth. I'll pass it over to you, Axel, for reflections. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth. This is a very relevant question. So, of course, if now public international climate finance would be used to buy ITMOs and cancel them, then I would think, yes, that would be a proper use, because it's clear that the ITMOs then are seen as a kind of MRV of the mitigation achievement of that climate finance, and that, in my view, would be legitimate. Thank you.
Excellent. And again, this is why it's important to contextualize the principles that relate to both demand, supply, and as well as transparency. So they need to be kind of interpreted as a whole package. We also have a question here in relation to whether there's a specific view on approaching corresponding adjustments for corporates buying for the purposes of making voluntary compensation rather than contribution claims, bearing in mind the third authorization use case being other purposes. So I'd also like to pass over to Axel to answer this one. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Actually, my colleague Hanna-Mari Ahonen, who is in the crowd and who has contributed to the principles, she's been working on this quite intensely, also with various stakeholders. And indeed, the formal offsetting should always be related to ITMOs with corresponding adjustment. If, for example, a company now buys a mitigation contribution unit, that would be a contribution to the host country NDC and definitely cannot be used for offsetting purposes. That's why we tried also to be quite specific in the principles to differentiate between those cases. Thank you.
Thank you. And one final question we have here is most countries haven't submitted their BTR yet, despite the deadline being December 2024. When will they submit and how can we overcome this in the future? I think this is an excellent point about why we cover off the importance of BTR disclosures within the principles in order to encourage the incentive that they actually, are reported as part of responsible use under Article 6. Lambert, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, very briefly. I think it's quite understandable that not all countries manage to submit the BTR because it's really the first BTR, and many countries have much more reporting requirements, developing countries in particular, than they had in the past. So it's really the first time that they need to comply with very comprehensive reporting requirements. I would very much hope that in the future there will be a regular cycle and countries will really submit every 2 years. But I think that's also something that therefore we've put it in the principles that host countries, but also buyers should watch out for, because it's really the corresponding adjustments are applied in BTRs. And if there's no BTR, there's no corresponding adjustment.
Excellent. Thank you, Lambert. And kind of building off of that in terms of where we are now in terms of Article 6 operationalization, but given that it is a long-term mechanism in reflection of the fact that the Paris Agreement in turn is a long-term agreement, I think it's really important that we also see these principles again as the starting point for what responsible engagement can look like. And again, within the principles, we do encode recommendations to annually review strategies and whatnot to ensure that it's, again, that strategies aren't set once and forgotten, but really do keep tabs on the iterative development of the mechanisms under Article 6. So with that, and at the top of the hour, I'll now draw the webinar to a close with a very big thank you to my fellow panelists, starting with Professor Mette Morsing for her opening remarks, and of course Dr. Axel Makawa, Dr. Lambert Schneider, and all the co-authors and reviewers that contributed to the development of the principles. We now look forward to seeing them applied in practice, and so please look out for continued engagement and discussion in this space as we enter this phase of Article 6 operationalization. Once more, thank you for attending today's webinar. We look forward to your continued engagement on this very important issue and wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.